Good morning, everyone. Um, we still have people trickling in, but I figure I'll get started with some of the housekeeping. Welcome to Coffee and Climate. Um, we, Before I introduce our guest, I just want to remind folks of a few things. One being that this session is recorded, and we'll be sharing out the recording in our follow-up email to all who've registered. And another thing too is that we do now have a Q&A feature available in Coffee and Climate. You can find that at the bottom of your screen and feel free to drop in questions. I will say we have a fantastic presenter today though, and we'll only have about 15 to 20 minutes left in the hour to address some of the audience questions and a couple of the ones in the Q&A. So you can also feel free to wait until the end and raise your hand and we'll answer those questions via that way. But we've got a big crew joining us this morning, and I want to introduce our guest, Charlie Agnew, Vice President of Energy Services at Competitive Energy Services here in Portland, Maine. I'm really excited for this presentation. I think we'll be talking about something that's on everybody's mind right now, rising energy costs. So I am going to turn it over to you, Charlie.
All right, thank you, Katie. Is my audio coming in all right? Okay, great.
Perfect.
Well, I got my coffee and we can get started here just with a quick introduction. My name's Charlie Agnew. I work for Competitive Energy Services. We are a Portland-based energy consulting firm. We work exclusively with larger institutional, municipal, higher education, healthcare clients. So think about large energy consumers. So we do a lot of thinking about energy costs, energy rates, and the future of that to help our clients navigate the environment that we're in. So that's our perspective. Some of the content we end up preparing as a result is geared towards like educated consumers. I'm going to do my best to keep things nice and slow and steady here so folks can digest what I'm sharing here. But yeah, coming from a background of working in the wood pellet industry for a while, 13 years now at CES. I don't consider myself an expert because I have to learn something new every day, basically, and work with a lot of smart people here at CES that spend a lot of time thinking about energy and energy costs. And yeah, the dynamic environment is changing so much that it often doesn't make sense to prepare any sort of presentation until the day you're giving it, even. So here we go. Skip over the agenda slide. I'm going to start by just level setting with kind of an understanding of an electricity bill. I think that's probably important. So I've pulled up one of my utility bills from fantastic Central Maine Power. A lot of these look the same, but there are some nuanced differences. So just to point out, this is page one of the CMP bill that I'm showing. I've highlighted basically the two components of the utility bill that we'll talk about today, and they are separate items on the summary page. CMP delivery, we can think about that as the cost to deliver, distribute, and move bulk electricity around New England, and ultimately to your house, your meter. That delivery component includes certain, basically it's a way that CMP recovers all of their cost. They have the luxury of doing that as a regulated utility. They recover all their costs through these delivery fees. And that cost and rates are regulated by the Maine Public Utilities Commission. And that's what you get from CMP is, focused delivery, reliability, meter, and kind of the poles and wires service. The actual electricity that flows through those poles and wires is what we refer to as supply. Um, most consumers have options as to how you purchase that supply, but um, for a residential customer, that's typically through the standard offer, which is also a procurement that is managed by the Public Utilities Commission each year. They go out to the marketplace and procure a supply contract on behalf of all standard offer customers, which gets the actual electrons flowing to customers. So those are the two components: delivery, supply. We'll talk a little bit more about that as this goes on. Page two, I've taken two different snips, one of each of a couple different utility bills that I own, to point out that page two is exclusively a breakdown of CMP's delivery costs. And there's a whole bunch of stuff embedded in these costs that I can share a little bit about. But there's a couple different rate options that you have as a residential customer. I have two of those shown. One is their residential electric technology rate. This is appropriate for a high volume electricity consumer, EVs, heat pumps, that sort of thing, even electric hot water heaters. And then a regular residential rate, which is the default unless you as a consumer elect a different rate class from through CMP, and that's something that you would need to request. So those charges for their delivery service might include a monthly service charge or a monthly minimum charge. In the case of this residential account, you have a minimum charge of $30.21. In the case of the electric technology rate, it's kind of the same thing, but it's a higher fixed monthly cost. And then there's kind of charges for the additional kilowatt hours above and beyond that fixed monthly service charge. Combination of those two things make up your delivery costs. Page three, if you have signed up for these net metering, net energy billing credits, might look something like this. This is a table that basically lays out, my usage, electricity usage. Please don't judge me for that, but monthly use for my house, and then the credits that were allocated from that remote solar project under the state's net energy billing program. So that might be what your page 2 or 3 looks like. I guess I'll make one note here that basically what I got charged for from CMP in this month was the difference between my use and the generation that was allocated. So the solar project delivered me 528 kilowatt hours. My use was 998. And if you go back to this upper box here, you'll see that I was billed for the difference, the 470 kilowatt hours. So the 528 were reversed off of my bill through this program. So that's kind of the value that you get out of the program. And then finally, page 4, or the last page of your bill, I should say, this is where the supplier charges show up. I'm on standard offer, and they basically just take the number of kilowatt hours that they're billing you, multiply it by the standard offer rate, and that's that. So I'll point out, you may have a different ratio of delivery versus supply costs. In this example, my delivery rates were about 60% of the bill. The supply was about 40% of the bill. That's going to look a lot different if you're not getting net metering credits. Your usage profile, if you're a very small user, that's going to look a lot different. But just order of magnitude, those costs can be, I would say 60-40 roughly in either direction. Your supply cost might be 60%, in some cases, and your delivery costs might be 60%. So they're about, on average, probably about equal. So that was my level set. I guess one other note, we commonly will talk in kilowatt hours and megawatt hours. A megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours. And when we talk about costs, a kilowatt hour that costs 10 cents is 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That's equivalent to $100 a megawatt hour. And I didn't clean up this presentation to be entirely consistent there. So, when you see $100 a megawatt hour, that's 10 cents per kilowatt hour. But I'm going to switch, Katie, here to kind of the outlook on electricity. My task here today was to explain, why electricity or where the costs of electricity are derived, and I'm also going to share a little bit about where we think those costs are going. And so I wanted to start with some kind of macro level observations. The first of which is that, we saw, significant changes in federal energy policy in 2025. And those are, kind of far reaching with respect to, reduction and elimination eventually of federal tax credits for renewable energy projects, wind and solar, environmental regulation that has been changed in favor of increased emissions, or basically fewer bans on emissions controls for power generation. We've also started to see a lot of focus and attention on affordability, and energy prices are kind of leading the inflationary costs throughout the United States right now, for a number of reasons. Energy has become more expensive, but there has also been other issues such as just the general demand for electricity growing. Everyone's probably heard of how energy intensive the data centers are, and how rapid those facilities are being built across the country, creating increased demand and challenges for our electricity grids. Just a couple months ago, we dealt with a kind of a record and historic storm, the winter storm Fern, that really blanketed a huge amount of the United States. It caused loss of production of natural gas and oil as that prolonged cold weather froze in production of the fuels that we extract here in the United States, and also created so we're kind of reducing the supply and production of fuels, at the same time creating demand for fuel. And due to the cold temperatures, it created kind of a historic amount of price volatility, and due to that kind of prolonged cold period. So we're really just kind of coming out of that dynamic and entering a new one with the war in Iran. And we'll talk more about how we anticipate that will impact our electricity prices. So, some of those impacts, again, I'll mention affordability. Like, this is going to be front and center for, I think, a lot of the gubernatorial races, and presumably here in Maine too. The issue around affordability and energy is at the forefront of that. I'll mention reliability. That's maybe one area that we do see improving. I mean, absent more brutal storms, winter storms that might roll through, there has been a lot of effort to manage and improve electric reliability. But the flip side of that is it costs money, it requires investment. Um, and then, some of you may also be thinking about environmental, the impacts of electricity consumption and generation and how that impacts us all. Um, so we'll talk a little bit more about how renewables, how we see the cost and development of renewables playing out over the next 5 years as well. So some of the high level stuff to cover. But starting with the affordability issue, I'm showing on the left side of the screen, the decade of electricity prices, both the supply component, which is shown in orange, and delivery, in blue. So this is just for relativity. You can ignore the total all-in costs. The point here is that over the past decade, we've seen the total cost of electricity go from about 10 cents a kilowatt hour all in to over 20 cents a kilowatt hour over the past decade. So doubling in that roughly in that time period. Um, Interestingly, and at the same time, our natural gas costs have really remained relatively stable over that same time period. So again, gas not getting so much attention, electricity is a real issue in and around affordability. And we'll start to get into a little bit, as to why that is. I'm going to start on the utility side. So these are the delivery rates we talked about. CMP is making as much as they can investment in their distribution system to add resilience, to build durability of their system and network, and improve reliability, kind of in the face of a changing climate and more challenges that have come up in the past decade with respect to storms and storm outages. And you could say they are very eager to do this. They're working on a 5-year plan that might involve as much as $400 million of investments to kind of with dual purpose of accommodating the like asset renewal. So think about like reconductoring wires, tree trimming, rebuilding substations, and all to increase resiliency of our grid and also to support the growth that they see in certain pockets of the state, particularly the Portland area, and in light of all the electricity or more greater amount of electricity that is anticipated to be used over the next decade. That's kind of the CMP side of your delivery rates. And again, embedded in those delivery rates are also our regional transmission costs, which aren't entirely borne or I should say a part of CMP's costs. I mean, you get billed by CMP for these costs, but ultimately CMP has to pay for our state's kind of contribution to our regional transmission system for electricity. So this is of the bulk power system, the tallest poles and wires you see, in a 100-foot swath, cut out of, the forest or running along the highway. Those transmission systems were built a very long time ago. They're aging. They also require major investments to basically keep up with the power plant retirements, to meet the need of these kind of the changing dynamic in electricity use and growth, and also to interconnect new projects as they come along. So those costs are also heading up. These are big investments. They our system is old, and those costs are also increasing. Um, the Whether you've heard it or not, that net energy billing or net metering program that I talked about, as well as some of the um, kind of policy related contracts that CMP has been directed to enter into, kind of long-term contracts with renewable energy projects. CMP has basically contracted under a long-term agreements to buy some renewable electricity from various projects. That coupled with the net energy billing program, um, believe it or not, that those programs are actually costing CMP money. Those are one of the line items that they recover in their rates. And over the past 5 years, that amount of recovery uh, of their losses under that net metering program for the benefit of their customers, those are all getting recuperated in their rates. So collectively, those renewable programs, those are portion of them are also embedded in your delivery costs. Those have increased, I think, on a going forward basis. Um, there's probably not a lot of more costs that will be embedded in the delivery rates due to these renewable programs, but it is a significant cost component as it is today. So that all to say, in summary, we're seeing utility rates rise. The the underlying costs are some of these state programs that have created costs for consumers and deferred investments, plus increases in reliability that we will benefit from, but also will pay for over time. And just to give you a sense of what that kind of delivery cost component is, again, you can kind of ignore the numbers, but just to give you a sense, there's about half of CMP's delivery rates consist of transmission costs. So the regional transmission grid, about the other half is roughly the distribution side, where you have poles and wires along the roadside. Um, that system is kind of CMP's bread and butter. That's what they use to deliver electricity to you. We have stranded costs, which are the renewable programs, and a small amount of money that goes to the efficiency main trust to pay for the LED light bulbs and other programs that they, energy efficiency and weatherization programs that you pay into. That's all of the kind of embedded cost in your delivery rates, just to give you a sense of how that breaks down. So it's one simple line item on your CMP bill, but there are a number of different key components that add into that. Unfortunately, the largest of them are likely going to rise over the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm going to try and make a clean break from the delivery side, move over to supply side pricing. You can think about this as the electron, what it costs to deliver or create and sell the electrons that are generated. So just to give you a sense of what that's looked like over the past decade, roughly going from that 6 cents to 12-cent range. So supply costs have been doubling as well. In the world in which I live, that cost component gets broken down into a lot of different pieces too. But the biggest supply cost component is basically the energy that goes into creating an electron. So I've kind of put a total on the right hand side here. where you can see, the $70 a megawatt hour or 7 cents a kilowatt hour of 12 cents total is going and paying for the energy component of the electricity. That here in New England is natural gas. You've probably heard that before. The natural gas prices set the price of electricity in New England. Um, there are other smaller cost components that add up. We'll talk a little bit about the top three. So Maine RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, and the forward capacity market charges. Those are kind of the most material of supply side charges. So focusing just on the biggest nugget, this is electricity supply and the energy that goes into it. Just to give you a sense over the past 5 years, how those prices have trended, this is a little bit more granular because in our world, the market is moving every single day. We saw a huge amount of price suppression, coming out of COVID in 2020, 2021. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that created a huge amount of market volatility as the global landscape for natural gas started to shift. Europe rejected Russian pipeline gas and sought to purchase liquefied gas to meet and make up for that need. And that caused natural gas and thus electricity prices to push all the way up to some of the higher levels we're seeing here post invasion of Ukraine. Eventually the market normalized, it levelized. We are producing more natural gas here in the United States than anywhere else in the world. We're the largest producer of gas, so we have some control over this. But sometimes when you're creating so much gas, the prices will fall. That's what we saw in early 2024. We saw another dip in prices, reflecting kind of market sentiment when the Liberation Day tariffs were announced in April of 2025. And then you can see kind of the story since that point has been, I think, a steady rise in forward electricity prices, energy prices, as a result of the strong economic activity, the market viewing that as a favorable sign for the U.S. And then come February, we saw that most recent jump as a result of the U.S. going into Iran. So these are the sort of things that impact the energy prices. I think the big question is, at what point is this issue in Iran going to be resolved? Try and wake up every day with a positive attitude about that. But just to break down kind of the reality of what's going on in this region, we hear a lot about oil, but natural gas has kind of a similar story. This region produces natural gas as a byproduct of oil production. So this region of the world is also producing a lot of natural gas, probably way more than they need. And what you do at that point is you take that gas off of a pipeline, you cool it to negative 200 degrees to liquefy, turn it into a liquefied product, and it's highly, much more dense in that form. And these facilities that are capable of doing this liquefying natural gas put it on ships and send it into the global market. And Qatar, right in the kind of the center of this slide here, is one of the largest producers of natural gas in the world. About 20% of the world's liquefied or LNG comes from this part of the world. And at this time, or early on in the conflict, Iran had attacked some of Qatar's production facilities. There's been further escalation with attacks on one of the largest production fields in this region. And that has led to the ceasing of natural gas production and no more shipments of LNG out of this region. And that becomes a problem for us, and setting all the other issues aside, tying this back to New England electricity prices, because it does feel like we're a long way away from the Middle East. New England, you've probably heard, does actually rely on liquefied natural gas, and we have plenty of natural gas pipeline capacity, 9 months of the year. But when temperatures are below freezing, we utilize liquefied natural gas that is injected into our pipeline system off in facilities that are in New Brunswick and the Boston area. We take liquefied natural gas off of a ship, put it in the pipeline. That helps to stabilize and inject more capacity into our natural gas system when that system is threatened. And as a result, New England is now tied to the price of liquefied natural gas. And our electricity prices, exclusively in the wintertime, are very much impacted by those LNG prices. And the writing on the wall here is, less production. 20% of the world's production has come offline. Prices for LNG have, as a result, jumped, and the resolution to this is very uncertain right now. The timeline certainly unknown as to whether the product could start flowing through the Strait of Hormuz out into the global marketplace, and whether these facilities can recover from some of the damage that has already been done. I had a second slide, just more explicitly, this in the news was this production field in South Pars gas field, which is shared between Qatar and Iran. This is the specific area that's been targeted in recent attacks. So that the threat of that production being taken offline for longer than just the duration of this conflict is of great concern. So, again, trying to keep a positive attitude, but this is kind of real life influence on the largest component of our electricity supply costs being natural gas, and the natural gas market is upside down right now. I mentioned I was going to talk about three components of the supply costs that are most significant. So we've covered energy. That was the $70 of the 120 per megawatt hour. The next biggest chunk is the state's renewable portfolio standard costs. So this ties back to some legislation that obligates all electricity in the state of Maine that is sold to any consumer. There's a minimum amount of renewables that must be included in that mix, which is great. And a lot of people don't know this, but in this year, 63% of your electricity will be coming from renewables. Half of that is hydro and other existing resources, which might include municipal solid waste facilities or biomass facilities, but it's a lot of that is hydro. And then kind of the incremental amount above that 30% is all coming from wind and solar. So this policy right now we're on kind of on a glide path or trajectory, I should say, that to make that 63% go to 80 by 2030. This is written into the Maine's renewable portfolio standard. We have an increasing amount of electricity that will be coming from renewables, 80% by 2030, 100% by 2040. One of the challenges we have now after the one big beautiful bill that was passed last July 4th, effectively removed federal tax credits for wind and solar projects, which kind of flies in the face of our state level policy and objectives, and ultimately will make developing those projects much more expensive. And the environment right now has been very uncertain. Um, kind of adding on to that, the challenges of building these projects at scale is significant, and we don't have to look far, behind us to see how challenging it was for, Avangrid to build the Clean Energy Connect project. This was the hydro connection to Quebec, and transmission line that terminates in Lewiston. That went through a statewide referendum, huge amount of time and effort spent on that project to not get approval, and then ultimately, through legal avenues, keep the project moving forward and finally bring that online in January. But that's just an example of how difficult it is to build transmission, to build renewable energy projects in the state of Maine. We have the not in my backyard mentality. So the takeaway here is that we have wonderfully ambitious renewable energy goals, but practically speaking, they're going to be very difficult to meet. So that's why we do expect this to be part of, the discussion this fall with our gubernatorial races. I got to wrap here. I got to keep moving. I know. One of the other things that ISO New England, so ISO New England is, we talked about the two items. The third on the supply side is you think about having the generation available to meet electricity load during every hour of the year. We've talked a lot about the poles and wires, and obviously those need to be built to reliably transmit the electricity. And on the other end of the wire is the generation that's needed to meet the load at all of our households and businesses. And that's ISO New England's job to manage, to make sure that at any hour of the year, we have enough generation available to meet load. And I think what you'll find interesting about this slide is the two horizontal dotted lines represent New England's electricity, all-time electricity peak load. The orange line in the summer, that was August 2nd, 2006. We hit an all-time peak during the summer, 28 gigawatts. Back in January of 2024, we hit an all-time winter peak of 22 gigawatts. And ISO's job is to make sure that all those gigawatts are available from a generation perspective, so we don't create a rolling blackout situation. Just for quick perspective, the bars, orange and blue, show ISO New England's projections for peak electric loads going out to 2050 in both summer and winter relative to our all-time peaks historically. So what we're seeing, the transition that's happening is due to all of the heat pump adoption and electrification. The projection is that we're going to need more power generation during the winter months to meet that heating load as early as 2035, and that peak winter load by 2050 is going to double the amount of generation capacity we would need here in New England, which is a lot. This is a huge kind of condition, all at, in an environment where we can't build renewables, or it's very expensive to build renewables, and we're already hamstrung in the winter months with generation because we're having to buy this LNG, or we're having to basically switch our natural gas power plant fleet over to oil during the winter months because we don't have enough gas, we don't have enough renewables to meet the current dynamic. And we're talking about, over the next 2 decades, that dynamic getting even more extreme. So this is going to be a big challenge for ISO New England. It's going to be a all hands on deck kind of approach. There is no like silver bullet to this. We're going to need more generation. We're going to need more renewables. We're going to need different fuel sources to meet this need. And the winter months are particularly challenging right now to do that. So I've got a summary here. We've covered a lot. Katie?
Keep going. I think it's a pretty complex topic, and I really appreciate you doing a really great job. Keep going.
Well, I've got just kind of a summary of what I've shared so far. I'm happy to kind of leave this on the screen and let folks digest and start taking some questions if there were any people that were left on here still interested.
Don't you worry, there's plenty of questions in the chat. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time. There's so many different variables in this complex system. But I see Bill Weber. I'm gonna allow you to talk. Go for it, Bill.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, this is great high level concentration, Charlie. And it is hard to keep positive feelings, especially in this day and age. In terms of the increasing electricity demand, I know the state is looking at thermal energy networks, and ground source heat pumps are much more efficient than air source heat pumps. I don't know whether that can bend that curve a little bit more on the demand, but there are certainly still tax incentives available for things that are, I think, incorrectly called geothermal. But I'm wondering whether you think that's a positive, something that can be a significant increase in reducing our demand.
Um, Generally, my feeling is that it's good technology. I mean, we obviously have challenges here with, geology and density. Um, and I guess the reality of, or the layout of our state is one where you generally have like natural gas available in the population dense areas. That's already available. And outside of those population dense areas, you don't. And that's where a lot of people are utilizing heating oil. Um, I think if we were to target areas that are using the heating oil, or if there is a difference in efficiency, you could even say heat pumps. If we were to take customers that are presently using oil and propane, let's say, and convert them to a geothermal heating solution, that's without a doubt going to add to our peak electricity demand, right? If you did that same project in an area where people were utilizing natural gas to heat their homes, that would be a different story, right? You're in effect swapping the gas use for electricity use. The gas, whether it's gas or electricity, they're kind of one and the same. So theoretically, that would be, something close to a swap, if you will. So I guess the answer is it depends on what sort of consumers you're serving with that system.
Great question. Great question. I think I've got another question from the chat that might be helpful clarifying for some people. The question is about how, since electricity rates are kind of a function of natural gas prices, or natural gas sets the rate, we overproduce natural gas. why are these prices still going up?
Yeah, that is the question. So our just to re-articulate the interstate pipeline transmission system, you know, New England is, you know, uniquely positioned in that we're very close to one of the largest shale deposits of natural gas in the world. The Marcellus Shale, think about, kind of starts in the Pennsylvania, New York region and you know, goes slightly south into the west from there. So we're very proximate to a huge resource for natural gas. The issue is we have, you know, kind of primary pipelines coming into New England that were built um, decades ago and are not suited to accommodate the demand from the power sector, basically. You know, when temperatures drop below freezing, you start to the utilities get priority for their gas customers. So what I mean by that is like Unitil or other local distribution companies, they have priority on the pipeline for their gas customers. They're uninterruptible. You use the gas for heating water or in your boiler to heat your home. That is what's considered an uninterruptible customer. And there's a point, a temperature point in New England, which, you know, somewhere below freezing. It might not be exactly freezing, but it depends on the duration of the cold weather. You know, but if temperatures drop below freezing, we don't have enough natural gas in the pipeline to serve both the heating customers and the power plants. And so as the temperature drops, and this is kind of scaled, you start to see the natural gas fired power plants drop offline because they don't have the fuel or the fuel availability to make power. So they switch to oil or other resources are called upon. So that dynamic leads us to then have to buy alternative fuels to the natural gas, which subject us to the international price of liquefied natural gas or oil. And that's why we see these big spikes in the winter.
That's a fantastic answer. Thank you, Charlie. Do we have any other questions? Do folks want to raise their hands and ask any questions? Because if not, I'll keep pulling from the Q&A. Um, I have a question, yeah, from the chat. Um, I'm wondering if you might want to talk a little bit more about time of use rates and battery programs and how that might help reduce the overall growing demand.
Sure. So one of the embedded CMP costs is similarly, you know, to the kind of the ISO New England picture. The CMP has a certain amount of cost that's embedded in meeting a peak demand. You know, they have to build their system, their distribution system, and our regional transmission system doesn't get built for the average day of electricity consumption. It gets built for the peak day of electricity consumption. And when you look at the peak day, you know, those peaks are often relatively short-lived. They're right now our CMP grid peaks in the evening hours in both cooling and heating seasons. The dynamic where people are coming home from work, turning on the lights, turning up the heat, doing the work in the house or whatever electric plug loads exist. Those peaks are, or that activity drives CMP's peak to the evening hours and it's fairly well isolated, like 11 out of 12 months of the year, it's going to be 6 to 8 p.m. And then some random month in April when there isn't a lot of, when you might get a very cold morning, in April, you might see CMP's grid peak be at 9 a.m. or something like that. So the battery technology does certainly lend itself well to kind of reducing your load when those peaks are occurring. One of the challenges as a consumer for this technology in general is matching up, trying to capture value from using a battery. It certainly, if you use a battery, it will help the grid, but you need to justify that through some financial savings. And in order to do that, we've actually made some progress where a customer, a CMP, can be on what they call a time of use rate, where they're looking at your demands between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. each weekday, non-holiday weekday. And if you're able to deploy a battery during that time period, in theory, you can be saving some money on your CMP bill. But the challenge is that you need to save enough money to overcome, two primary things. Number one, the cost of the battery. You need to be able to pay for that, and they're not cheap. Number two, you need to be able to recover what are referred to as like round trip losses, because after you discharge that battery, you have to charge it again, and you have to put effectively 5 or 10% more into the charge than you get coming out of it every time. And that, over the course of the lifetime of the battery, as everyone knows, like with your cell phone, that changes, right? So you have to put, over time, you're putting more power in than you get out. So you have to overcome the losses associated with that. And it's just a challenge. I mean, a challenge financially to make that work. I think it's possible, but I think ultimately for a residential customer that's considering that, there's a high likelihood that you're going to help CMP, but not really help yourself.
Thank you, thank you. I'm gonna try and wrap a couple questions into one question. What do you kind of see as the future plan to realistically meet these electricity demands? Let's say if we aligned federal and state policy to gear us towards building more solar and wind, would that help us obviously meet the demand, but how might that affect prices? I guess you have a beautiful summary up on the slide to the left, and I know you don't have a magic ball to predict the future, but I guess people are curious how we're realistically going to meet that electricity demand.
Yeah. Pretty grim in the near term. So I'll just mention, we've already seen what's happened is states, including like Connecticut, have basically redefined their goals. We're going to have to redefine the goals. The first step was for states in New England, or Connecticut in particular, who has nuclear generation. They quickly changed their kind of approach and claim that as a renewable or zero carbon generation resource. And that kind of helped alleviate some of the pressure of their clean electricity goals. That will only go so far. Maine is in a interesting, or I guess tough position. I mean, we have so much some great renewable resource already with hydro. Theoretically, you could reclassify that as a higher value renewable, but that's going to depend, like I said, on kind of political swings that we see here in Maine. And it will be addressed. This is going to get addressed in the near term, but I think the only option we have really is to redefine the goals. Beyond that, um, from a reliability perspective, it's inevitably going to involve more fossil fuels. Um, Peak demands and the ability to build power plants is so challenging. My best guess is that we're going to have to make better use of existing fossil fuel plants, and they're going to run more often than they do today. Um, and then lastly, I am optimistic that at some point in the future, we'll be able to build offshore wind. Um, that resource is significant. It has the scale that we need. On and also it has the um, resource that we need, which is uh, winter reliability. Offshore wind or wind in general is at its best in the winter time. The challenge with all of that is just the cost, and so the question comes back to this affordability issue, like what are we going to be willing or able to accept? And so yeah, I think it's a combination of those things. Redefine the objective. Unfortunately, fossil fuels are going to be needed for reliability, and the renewables are going to take a longer time frame because we really need we're at the very beginning of kind of a shift in that or in our ability to build those sort of projects.
That is that is a sad answer, but I appreciate you kind of framing it in the world we're currently living in. Um, and yeah, who knows what a future administration may bring.
Yeah, Kay, I mean, this was again one of the things I started with is like federal policy changed last year, and it can change next year. Well, not well,
Yeah,
it can change just like within a year time frame, or maybe it's a little bit longer than that from where we sit today. But things change, and again, I think over time, presume that level heads will prevail, and there's a reality, a practicality to the world that we're living in, and I trust that will eventually um,
for
rise.
sure.
Yeah,
For sure. Um, there's a lot of compliments in the Q&A to you, Charlie, and yeah, I want to thank you again for really, I mean, it's such a complex web of things going on that affect these costs. So I appreciate you breaking it down for us and for everybody here this morning. And happy Friday to everybody. Thank you all for joining us for Coffee and Climate. Thank
thank
you,
you.
Charlie.
Have a good day.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.